What I see here is my bass line, my lowest pitch in every chord. If I see nothing below the note, that means it implies a root position chord with all of the pitches that the key signature designates. So in this case, D, F, A. So D, F, A, or a D minor chord, starting with that note. There's nothing here. For the next chord, I have a 6 and a 4, which is a second inversion triad. So this would be an E on the bottom. That means an A and a C on top. But wait, there's more. The 6 has a slash through it, and as I saw up here, the slash means to raise that note, in this case, the 6th or the C, by a half step. C is natural in this key, so raising it a half step means a sharp. The next note is an F, and it has a 6, which means a first inversion triad, with F as the lowest note. That means that the other pitches will be A and D. Finally, in the first measure, we have a G sitting all by itself, so we have a root position G chord. So this measure has D minor, A major, D minor, G minor. Now, Roman numerals can often let you notate something that then could be analyzed. Figured bass will often let you notate something which can then be analyzed with Roman numerals. That's fine. But figured bass doesn't need the Roman numerals in order to show you which notes to produce. You can create a fully functional piece of music and tell people exactly which pitches to create without Roman numerals. Sometimes it's even easier to illustrate something with figured bass than with Roman numerals because it doesn't clearly fit into a single key. Moving on, we have this note here with a 6 and a 4. That means it's a second inversion triad. This is our tonic chord again, our initial chord, and it's got a D and an F with A as the lowest note. Taking us here to a B flat all by itself, root position. Now we get somewhere really interesting. We have the bass note, which has been changed already from a G to a G sharp. But we also have a natural sitting all by itself. This natural, because it's not next to, and by next to I mean to the left or right, of another number, then that means it applies to a third above the bass. In this case, that's also a third of the chord. So we've got G sharp provided, but then we created a B natural and now a D. That leads us to here. Oh, whoops, I realized that I have something missing. There we go. That leads us to here where we have a sharp that's not next to a number, meaning to the left or right of a number, and then a 7. So this is telling me a root position 7th chord. We'll start with that. Root position 7th chord, but the sharp here says a third above the bass should be raised by a half step. So a C sharp. Let's recap this measure. We have a D minor chord, a B flat major chord, a G sharp diminished chord, and then an A major minor 7th or an A dominant 7th. Let's move on. Again, we have a note without anything below it, so that says it's a root position triad, just as the key signature would tell us, D minor in this case. And then a B flat major, again, just as the key signature would tell us. This here is a first inversion chord, we see by the 6 in the symbol, and an A in the bass tells us that it would be an F major chord. If this is the third of the chord, if this is the lowest note in a first inversion, that means my other pitches in the chord are F and C. Now, speaking of C, our next pitch is C, and we have a 7 here. So C, E, G, and B flat. Because there's nothing next to the 7. There's nothing telling me to change from what the key signature has. I leave it exactly as it is. So to recap here, we have a D minor, a B flat. Oops, I accidentally created a B flat 7. Why didn't you tell me to stop? It's okay. So we have a B flat major chord, and then we have an FAC, first inversion F major chord, and then a C7, a C dominant 7 here. It's a good thing I went back and checked my work. Let this be a lesson to us all. Proofreading matters. So now let's look at the next line. We start off with an F major chord. You might have noticed that we sort of slipped in between a couple of different keys already. So if I were doing Roman numerals, this would be a little bit more complicated to determine exactly what key, what's my tonic, what do the Roman numerals stand for. But with figured bass, it's not really a big deal at all to show all of these changes because all I'm showing is intervals and their relationship to the bass. Here we have a first inversion chord with D in the bass. That means I need an F and I need a B flat. It's a B flat first inversion chord. Ah, fun stuff here. I have a B flat in the bass and it says 6/5. Well, if you weren't sure what to do, you could just stick a 6 and a 5 in there and that would be a pretty good start. And that would work in a lot of contexts. But if you know that 6/5 also has a separate meaning, then that will give you even more information. 6/5 is the first inversion of a 7th chord, which means the root of this chord is G, and the chord will be G, B flat, D, F. So I need all the rest of those notes. So I'm going to write my D and my G and my F. As a reminder, when I have inverted 7th chords and I have notes that are a second apart, you're going to line them up to where the higher one is to the right, the lower one is to the left, and then line them up based on where a line would be if there was a stem to that note. If they occur in different voices, for example, a soprano and alto that are sharing the same staff, and there are notes that are a second apart, those don't go the highest one to the right. Those line up the stems, and they just go on whichever side they would normally go. So typically that means that the higher one will be the opposite. Now we have a 7 with a sharp. So like we learned before, that means create a 7th chord. And the sharp that's not next to anything else means sharp the third. The third above the bass. Whenever we're talking about it, it's always above the bass. Now, in this case, the 7 also means it's a root position chord, so the third above the bass is the third of the chord. But if there were another inversion symbol there, this means it's not a root position chord, and the symbol was still by itself without a number next to it, it means the third above the bass. So now let's recap this. We've got an F major chord, a B flat major chord, ooh, this wonderful chord here, a G minor 7th chord, and then an A dominant 7. Good stuff going on there. Now we have D next to nothing, which returns us back to our root position D minor chord we've seen before. And now we have a 4/2, but the 4 has a plus next to it. So what is 4/2, first of all? Well, a 4/2 symbol means that it's a 7th chord in its final position, its third inversion. We have 7, 6/5, 4/3, and 4/2. So that means that this note here is actually the 7th of the chord. And the root of the chord would be a step above this. So the root of this chord is an A. So I've got A, C, E, G. A, C, E, and then G in the bottom. Now, the plus there means the 4th above the bass is raised by a half step. So in this case, it's that C sharp that we've seen raised in a few other chords. Next, we have an F there with a 6, which means that F is the third of the chord. It's in first inversion. So the chord is a D, F, A. And here we have an E with a 7. So we have E, G, B flat, D. So that's not a chord we've seen a lot so far. That's an E diminished chord with a minor seventh added onto it, or what we would call an E half diminished seventh. And here we have an A with a 6 and a 4, so that is a first inversion D chord. And then we have an A with a 7 and a sharp, and we've seen this a couple of other times. That's our A, C, E, where the C is sharped. So recapping here, we have F major, B flat major, G minor 7, A dominant 7, D minor, A dominant 7 again, just a different inversion of it, D minor, E half diminished 7, D minor, A dominant 7, and, well, what is that? A D with a 4 and then a dash and then a sharp? Well, if ever you get to a symbol you don't recognize, like I said before, just reason it out. Just think, what could I put there that would make musical sense? The numbers are all referring to intervals. So if this says a 4, that means I want a note that's a fourth above. And then there's a dash, which means movement within that part, to a sharp next to nothing. Well, the sharp next to nothing, as we've seen in other examples, says that's a third above. So now we have a fourth above going to a third above that's sharped. Okay, that starts to make a little bit more sense. D, and then G, D, and then F sharp. Okay. Because 4 is the only other number there, because there's nothing else there, I can reason out that it's probably referring to a D major or D minor chord, where I have the D, F, and A. But instead of the F, instead of the 3, I have a G. So in this case, D, and then G, and then A. Instead of D, F, A. And because this moves, it's going to go from 4 to sharp 3, or from D to F sharp. So this is a case in which I really couldn't express that idea with Roman numerals. And there's a number of times with figured bass where you put something that doesn't really make sense with Roman numerals, but it makes perfect sense with figured bass, at least once you've had a little bit of experience with it. With most of these, the symbols were standard inversion symbols. When they weren't standard inversion symbols, they were maybe an unusual inversion symbol, we could reference the knowledge that we have, or we could just reason out the chord. And when they weren't an inversion symbol at all, they were something entirely different, we just can logically work through the chord. When in doubt, just put a note on that number. If we hadn't put the A there, we would have had a slightly incomplete chord, but we still would have gotten the most important ideas behind what's going on there. Sometimes when you see this, you actually will see 5-4 and then to the sharp, just to show you that you're going to do each of those. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, why? Why would I do this? Well, a couple reasons. One is that it teaches you the idea of intervallic relationships. We've probably talked at some point already about how composers for many centuries thought more in terms of intervallic relationships between parts than they did with strictly the harmony that those parts made. It's going to give you a better awareness and a better understanding as to how each of these parts interact with each other if you're thinking in terms not just of what chord they make, but how the distance between them changes from chord to chord, from part to part. Also, great music is not built entirely vertically. You're going to have a sense of vertical knowledge as well as horizontal knowledge, as well as the line and contour of each of these parts. We don't always love a song because of its chord progression. We often love a song because of its melody, because of the linear notion to the parts. So that's a really important thing too. On top of the fact that this is in many music theory circles and on the AP test, this is a big part of the test. What's more, it can give you so much more freedom in how you can relate and relay and construct chords and analyze chords and approach chords when you don't really know exactly what the tonal center is doing, or when it shifts from one thing to another. So Hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully this helps you understand a lot more of how figured bass works, because we're going to be using it a lot this year.